Okay, great. I'm going to get going. Welcome to Masterclass 4 from the Building a Subscription Business Collective. This masterclass is about defining your customer strategy, messaging strategy. With Piano, we've got Tim and Matthew from Piano who are going to run today's session. Just before we get started, as you're all familiar with now, I'm just going to do the housekeeping. So we are back in attendee panelist format on this webinar for anyone that's joined previous ones. What that means is we don't get to see your pretty faces and you don't get to see each other, unfortunately, but there is a chat function if you do want to talk to each other or to us. Questions, Q&As, please, in the Q&A function. So that is along your menu bar where you should be able to see participants, chat and Q&A. If you just open up that window and any questions you have, please ask throughout. I will be, as I always do, looking at those Q&As throughout and feeding them to Tim and Matthew, who have enough time, plenty of time at the end to do your to go through your questions. So please do ask throughout. You are muted, but this is recorded. As you already know, we put these up on the website within 24 hours of hosting this live panel. So the recording and the slides will go up and be shared with you after the event. That's everything I have from housekeeping. So I'm going to hand over to Tim and Matthew now from Piano for the session. Hope you enjoy.
Thanks, Jules. So just to introduce myself, my name's Tim Rowell. I'm the General Manager of Piano in the UK. And Matthew, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. My name is Matthew Harrison. I'm a Senior Strategist based out of our Oslo office in Norway.
Thank you. If we go to the next slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with Piano, we are a software and services company that helps predominantly media and publishing companies to build a subscription business. We have a software platform that enables clients to acquire, manage and retain subscribers. And in recent years, we've worked extensively with clients to optimize their subscription efforts to drive additional revenue. And a key part of that is ensuring that you're presenting the right message to the right customer at the right time. And, you know, for those of you who are involved or running a subscription business, you'll be very familiar with, you know, it's tweaking one message might deliver an incremental increase in conversion rate. And it's that kind of optimization that helps drive the business forward. So we're just going to talk about some of the principles behind that thinking today. And Kevin, sorry, if you go back to the previous slide. What we're structuring this around is a framework, a customer journey framework that we focus a lot of our software development and strategy work upon. And the way to read this is that you have the segments along the top. And what we're trying to do is to get at each stage and each segment that a user is placed in on a website, we're trying to identify, well, what's the next best action for that user to take in order to get them down the funnel. Now, granted, you know, it's not entirely linear. There are many situations in which a user will jump straight from coming to the site to becoming a subscriber. But I think there's one thing we're very clear on is actually, when you're running a subscription business, it's not just about one single conversion rate. You've got to think about growing your business based on a series of micro conversions. And as we talk through some of the principles today, you'll begin to understand how those micro conversions combine to help you develop a successful business. So I'm going to hand over to Matthew at this point just to start running through the slides. Please do drop any questions as we go into the chat box, and I'll decide whether to address them then, or we might hold some of them back till the end. But Matthew, over to you.
Okay, so thanks everyone for joining our webinar. And today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about subscriptions generally in the world today. And we'll move on to best practice in terms of segmenting an audience and how you can then use those segments to deliver different subscription journeys to very different readers based on their needs. You can deliver different tactics and messaging, etc. So we've allotted about 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the end for questions, but please do drop them in as and when as we're going through the presentation. Okay, so subscriptions today, where to start? I think what's obvious is that they're everywhere. Not just talking about subscriptions and news, but generally. So this quotation says it all for me, the fact that we're a planet of 7 billion people, and just in terms of mobile subscriptions, there's 5 billion. And everyone on the call today probably has at least 5 or 6 subscriptions of their own. So we're coming into this with a sense of enormity. And even crazier still, subscriptions are growing. According to Gartner, by 2023, 75% of organizations selling direct to consumers will offer subscription services. So this is an immense market here. I think it's fair to say as well that subscriptions are complex. So thinking about the many different reasons why somebody might take out a subscription, and there's hundreds of them, as those of you on the call will know. It can vary in market to market, and Tim, I'm sure that you've experienced so many in your kind of previous roles. So I think it's interesting just to touch on this complexity as well. We can just go to the next slide. So in publishing, this has brought challenges, and this graphic from a Digiday survey makes that quite clear. So you have 6 primary challenges for publishers in this new subscription world. And the top 3, I think, relate fairly cleanly to the challenges around growing a loyal audience, whether that's converting them, whether that's developing a product that resonates in market, or whether that's just finding an optimal price point. The other 3 challenges, well, they're kind of all about the internal challenges of growing a new newsroom, new editorial teams that are focused primarily on subscriptions as a revenue stream. So we can go to the next one. But crucially, it's not all about challenge. There's also opportunity. And as the Reuters report that was released last week kind of showed very clearly, that paid media is up everywhere around the world. More global populations in very different geographies are engaging with paid media, often for the first time. So this brings a lot of opportunity for publishers who are pivoting towards subscriptions now, and they need to understand the benefits of audience segmentation so that they can deliver the right messages, the right tactics, as Tim said, not just the right tactics, but at the right time in the right place.
And it is, yeah, it is striking, just looking at the last 2 months, 3 months of the pandemic. Everyone's aware that there's been a growth in subscriptions over that period. We're fortunate with sort of 300 publishers on our platform. We get to see a significant amount of aggregate data, and we can compare and we can look at the trends. So this is based on our customers, and the analysis, we've been running this every week, but in the 3rd week of May, subscription acquisition was up 85% in Europe and 25% in the US compared to the weekly average in January and February. What's more reassuring beyond this is actually the churn rate is far reduced for these new subscribers than it is for the subscribers that were there before the pandemic. So, again, we definitely feel, with the media sector in particular, that a change that everyone was predicting would happen over a period of time, maybe 2 to 3 years, actually happened over the space of 2 months. Making this, discussion and focus on subscriptions more important than ever.
Great. So let's talk a little bit now about segmenting an audience against this backdrop of an extraordinary changing world and subscriptions as a growing phenomenon. So I put this quotation in our presentation today because it really resonates with me, and hopefully it does with those of you on the call as well. I see a lot of publishers who take a great piece of technology and then they retrofit it to an audience. Whereas I think segmentation, best practice, dictates that you should always start with the customer and then bring the technology to their needs. So as we talk through segmentation today, hopefully tying it back to reader needs will become clear. Okay, so many ways of segmenting an audience. And we have 2 wonderful segments on this slide already. We've got the Tim segment and we've got the Matthew segment. So you can segment an audience, as many of you who work in publishing on the call will know, by many different criteria categories. And Tim, feel free to jump in with some suggestions. But you could do it by content interest. So for instance, the Tim segment might be interested in politics or history. I might be interested in sport or celebrity news. I'm not actually interested in celebrity news, by the way. I think this is just reflective of two very different types of audience segment. So you might want to segment them by loyalty. In terms of loyalty metrics, well, there are hundreds, no doubt. In this case, by page views, but you could equally do it by consecutive days of use or time on site. You could segment readers by their online behavior. So that could be device type. It could be how long they're on a site. If we take the example here, the Tim segment might be on site in an evening using desktop, compared to a segment that is primarily mobile in a morning. And then finally, you could segment by demographic. So you could have a slightly older demographic versus a slightly younger demographic. So what do all of these segments mean, and what is best practice in terms of doing it? Because it's all well and good to be able to understand different loyalty habits like this one, or if we skip to the next slide, different content habits. And across all of the publishers that I have the privilege of working with, they have very, very different ways of segmenting, even within these categories, whether that's different loyalty metrics, different content habits. But what can we tie it all back to? For me, it's got to be about reader need states. So many of you might have seen this, this framework on the right-hand side here, the Bain pyramid of needs. It's a bit like Maslow's pyramid of needs. You have 4 different types of human need. You have the functional, the emotional, the life-changing, and the social impact. And I always encourage my clients to try and think about how they can meet these very different types of reader needs via segmentation learnings. So in other words, how can we tie what we understand about your segments back to these needs so that we can make assumptions about reader groups? So to use our examples of the Tim segment and the Matthew segment, if the Tim segment likes politics or history, perhaps that points to an emotional need for a bit of nostalgia. If they're on desktop in an evening, it points to a need for quality or information, versus the Matthew segment, celebrity, sport, gossip. That points to a need for fun entertainment, versus someone on mobile in the morning, perhaps they need to save time whilst on their commute. But hopefully you begin to understand how we can tie these different segmentations back to human need states. So what's the point of doing that? Well, by understanding these different human needs, you can actually deploy the right tactics and the right messaging at different points in this customer journey framework, as Tim said. And that encourages these next best actions that you have on the bottom. So a new reader, you really want them to return to your site. You want them to avoid bouncing, versus somebody that has been signed up for your subscription package for a long time, perhaps. Well, you really want them to promote your brand, promote your package, and not to churn. Tim, perhaps you want to speak to this one a little bit. For me, this is all about taking it to the next level. So once you've understood those human needs and how they apply to different segments, you then want to find other people to make that segment even bigger.
Yeah, that's a key point. I think there's an interesting trend we see within this market. As you dive into defining the segments, there is only so far that a human is capable of understanding whether someone has a high likelihood to convert. And in what we really feel, actually, over the next 2 to 3 years, you're going to see a much greater use of technology, and machine learning to identify the behavior, place the user in the segment, and then target them with a correct message. So, segmentation just forms a key part of both that sort of manual human analysis, plus also the technology-driven approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So we can take these kind of learnings from segmentation and now apply them to some real-world subscription journeys. So if we take a look at the next section. I've included a fantastic quotation from Bruce Springsteen. We deal with a lot of rock star publishers at Piano, but sadly not the boss. But he says, getting an audience is hard, sustaining it is hard. It demands that consistency of thought, purpose, and action. And I think across the clients that Tim and I work with, those who are the most successful have been the most successful at owning that consistency of thought, purpose, and action, and applying it to so many different types of micro conversions across that funnel. So let's take a look at some of them now. So if we have the first reader in the Tim segment, what do we know about them based on Piano benchmark data? What's still quite shocking to me as a strategist at Piano is that on average, 68% of a site's audience are just one-off visitors. So it shows you the size of the potential in terms of encouraging a few from that segment to not bounce, to engage with content, because it will give you a bigger opportunity further down the funnel in terms of selling subscriptions. So we could have a little think here about how we could engage the likes of the Tim segment with messaging, with tactics that resonate based on his need states. So if you remember, we established that Tim, with his different segmentation traits, might have a need for quality and information. So what's really great here is that we've got the pioneering tactic from the Daily Beast in this case, where they tried to give a welcome message to their first-time readers to convey a sense of brand that was personalized. So they had the caricature here of Tina Brown. But think about how you could do something similar across so many differentiated publishers around the world today, catered to very different need states if you could map that back and show it only to different segments. Of course, we see still in the market today, a lot of publishers, they kind of imagine that first-time readers have a lot more trust in their brand than they actually do in reality. So thinking about the pyramid of trust concept, you see a lot of publishers make an ask immediately of their audience when there has been no connection made. So here's an example, an anonymous example from the Hall of Shame of an immediate ask being made to a reader group. So they're immediately being asked to subscribe in this case, but they've not been given any reason to. There's no connection been made with the brand. So again, thinking back to that Jobs quotation, the idea of once you've managed to encourage someone from that Tim segment to stay on your site, how can you then increase their patterns of engagement, make your content part of their day-to-day? So according to Piano benchmark data, you can see that almost 4% of readers are active for 5 days or more in a 30-day period. So again, I think if me and you, Tim, are sitting here in a year's time, this figure will be much higher. We'll start to have seen publishers become increasingly savvy in terms of taking their first-time readers and converting them to becoming active.
Yeah, and I think it's important just to stress at this point that this benchmark data we're showing you here is based on all of our clients. So we get to see the audience of all our clients. It's anonymized, and this is aggregate data. But what we're able to do here is show you that across all of our client sites, so I think it's about 900 client websites, on average, for one-off users in any given month, i.e. viewing one piece of content, that's 68% of all users. Mm. And what we're saying here is actually, and it's important to think about these figures, that if you define an active user as someone who consumes five or more pieces of content, 5 or more active days in any given month, that is just 3.5% across all our, as a benchmark across all our clients. The point being here that it's a little bit of a different mindset. You've got to identify that audience who are consuming your content, who are displaying a degree of loyalty that indicates that they might become a subscriber, i.e. they value you. And some people get a little bit alarmed looking at these figures, sort of going, wow, that seems to get quite small quite quickly. but I think it is a change in approach that is evident across publishing now, of a sort of flight to quality, a focus on that loyal audience from, that's where the value is. It raises some interesting questions about the striving for reach, striving for that kind of growth, and it's arguable it's a very, very different strategy. But view the numbers in that context as we go through them here.
Absolutely right. And I think just thinking about all the things we know in terms of data points across these different categories in the reader journey, it's immense, right? I mean, you could think about anything such as referral source. Where are these readers coming to your site from? Are they social readers? Are they direct? Are they search? And based on this information and all of these hundreds of data points, what can we infer about their needs? Like if they're coming from social, they're probably coming direct into a piece of content. If they're coming from Facebook, we know that they like to be part of communities. The list goes on and on and on. But in the last few years, I've seen publishers become really, really intelligent in terms of how they go about communicating in very tailored ways with these first-time readers. So here we're looking at how we can start to engage your active readers a little bit more. So we don't want to make a big request, like sign up to a years-long subscription, because perhaps their patterns of engagement aren't quite entrenched enough for that yet. One thing we see a lot at Piano is a light ask, like turn off your ad blocker, as we can see 2 examples from the market here. And usually these light asks are presented in conjunction with bigger asks. That ensures that more people actually go ahead and take them. So you can see the example on Business Insider's template here. Readers are being asked to turn off their ad blocker. You might want to communicate the value of advertising to journalism when you're making that ask. But it's seen in conjunction with a subscription for $1. Now, actually, the default option is to subscribe. But I can imagine that a lot of readers will, probably like myself, think actually it's reasonable to turn off an ad blocker, isn't it? And they go ahead and take that action. But by making that request and having readers take an action, you're normalizing the sense of communication, the sense of this being a dialogue. So we can think about all of the different ways we can do that.
And it's interesting, Matthew, isn't it, that actually those users who do switch off their ad blocker tend to consume way more content post having switched it off than any other segment of users. And so it's an interesting step. If you think back to sort of micro conversions and trying to push people through the funnel, it seems slightly odd that ad blocker message would give you that kind of correlation. But for many of our clients, it's an important step.
Yeah, totally agree. So now we're looking at the proposed stage of the customer journey. A lot of people ask me, what does proposed actually mean? So it means being shown an offer, being shown a template. So perhaps a paid offer. You might be being asked to subscribe. You might be being asked to register for a newsletter, or even just to check out a cool piece of content. But what's interesting, and actually this is probably the benchmark, I don't know about you, Tim, but this is the benchmark that perhaps surprises me the most across the entire funnel. Because if only 11% of people are seeing an offer, then, potentially there's a lot of room to improve there. And how do people even know that a subscription package exists if they're not being told about it? So at this stage in the funnel, I guess the outcome that we're trying to drive is to, again, normalize the sense of conversation and dialogue, but to attach some sort of value to the content to make more people aware that a subscription package exists here.
I think it's a very good point, particularly in the context of media and publishing companies. There's always been a degree of reticence about interrupting the user's experience too much. If you think about this stat in these terms, what proportion of users who've reached that point on the site will actually ever see a subscription, an invitation to subscribe, or an offer? Now, 11% here is higher than certainly it was 2 years ago. I remember looking at aggregate data across the Piano platform, and we were looking at an average of around 2% of users were actually ever seeing some kind of subscription offer and were exposed to a paid offer. And of course, if you don't invite someone to become a subscriber, then they're not going to subscribe. And, you know, it's sort of reflected. And if you think about the models that have happened, certainly with media subscriptions, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, even 10 years ago, there was a lot of focus around meter heights and allowing 20 pieces of content. And of course, a lot of that was designed in order to protect advertising revenue.
Yeah.
I think the average, you know, say 20 page views 10 years ago. 5 years ago, that's probably dropped down to about 10 or 9. Now the average is certainly around 3 or 4. And actually most clients we work with are moving away from the sort of concept of having a meter to sort of adopting perhaps a freemium model or a premium model, which is a slightly different way of presenting their content and demonstrating value. Of course, if your meter height is too high, they're never going to see an offer because you're never going to hit that barrier because you've got too many pieces of free content. So it's a really important thing to think about is, you know, how many of my users are actually seeing an invitation to subscribe?
I'd just add in there as well, Tim, that our benchmark data tells us that on average, readers typically have to see an offer for 5 times before they engage with it. And it's probably no surprise in this world of growing subscriptions that that's the case, right? I mean, think how many times in a day-to-day that me or you see a modal template without even noticing it when we buy something from an app store, when we go into our Gmail account. These interactions are constant. We probably engage more with modals than we do with actual people in this age of coronavirus, especially. Okay, so let's have a look at offer presentation and how we would propose something to these different segments that we have here. So thinking to this Tim segment, we know that perhaps his content segmentation suggests he has a need for nostalgia. So we could tailor our messaging copy when making an ask accordingly. So here are just a few examples from across our client base and publishers around the world today, where they've clearly tailored messaging to either their history as a brand, or perhaps an anniversary, or perhaps an event that happened once upon a time. So we could perhaps with certainty say that this sort of messaging would resonate with Tim's segment if we have a good understanding of their needs. And of course, it's all well and good knowing what kind of messaging can resonate, but you want to know how to really make that proposal via a template to your readers. So our team, again, in strategic services, has done a lot of research into what type of interaction, what type of touch point works best. And here this slide's showing you quite clearly that a hard stop modal is more effective than a bottom ribbon by a factor of 283. But that's not to say that a bottom ribbon has no place in the world. It's just that in terms of increasing conversions, you might want to consider a modal.
And just to explain what these terms are, so modal is another word for a kind of pop-up message that appears on the screen. You can have, if we use the term inline, that's where you're reading a piece of content and the message appears in line with that content. And a ribbon is, you see this much more commonly now, but a ribbon at the bottom of the site that's not necessarily interrupting your overall experience, but it's there and very visible. And these kind of tactics, you've got to balance how you're presenting these invitations to subscribe or sign up for a newsletter. You've got to balance them and ensure that they're presented in the right way, that they don't really irritate the user. And of course, consistently presenting pop-up after pop-up, we all know how mad that drives people. So there is a sort of balanced set of, and style of messages one should put in place. But, this data is really saying, there comes a point where you have to have the confidence to stop someone and say, you can go no further. until you actually take some kind of action. And, you know, the benchmark data, as Matthew said, you know, if you present that hard stop at the right point, it's 283 times more effective in getting someone to take that action and subscribe. And that would happen after a series, you know, a longitudinal experience of messaging where you finally go, right, that's it. You're enjoying our content. This is the 5th time you've read an article in the last 4 days. You've got to give us something in return. And that's how you've got to think about how you present the message.
And again, we're seeing these tactics becoming even more innovative now. So to use like an example from myself, I read The Guardian a lot. And I've been able to read The Guardian for years without really any sort of communication via a modal, via an inline message. And then a few months ago, I had the message saying, you know, Matthew, you've read 1,000 articles in the last year, but you're not registered. Now, doing that as a bottom ribbon, it was impactful. But when it came at me as a modal, then I really knew that The Guardian needed my support. It was the right time in our relationship between consumer and brand to make that conversation happen. So definitely some good learnings here. If we take a look at a very different segment and their like journey to subscription. So in the case of the Matthew segment, as we're calling it, you have a reader who is perhaps known to the publication, but they haven't yet subscribed. So they have very different needs compared to the Tim segment, and we can communicate with them in very different ways. So let's take a look at some examples here. So looking back at that figure that you've just seen on the previous slide of, you know, most publications across our customer base now are trying to grow registrations. We're in the age of first party data. And again, Tim, perhaps you want to touch a little bit on this, but I'm seeing tactics for gaining registrations becoming increasingly savvy in terms of their messaging strategies. So I wanted to talk about a great example from a client that I'm currently working with in South Africa, the Daily Maverick. So they're trying to increase registrations or sign-ups to newsletters so that they can communicate with more readers, tell them a little bit more about their membership proposition. So here, this is a newsletter sign-up that you're seeing. If we think about why this might be tailored to a reader of Matthew's need states. So if you remember, he's got an interest in fun, entertainment, but also a need for saving time. Perhaps he's commuting in the morning when he's reading. So what this template does quite clearly is it gamifies it a little bit by saying, look, you know, help us hit our target in terms of sign-ups, be part of something. But it could also be given to me as an interaction in the morning. So that, and look at the messaging even, all the South African news that really matters, it plays into this sense of saving time. So hopefully you can see here how publications like the Daily Maverick are getting increasingly intelligent in terms of applying reader needs to how they go about their conversations with said readers.
And just to interrupt there, I just saw a question pop in saying, you know, do you see certain colours performing better than others? 100%. You know, there's a lot of things, you know, that relate to design, that relate to the wording, that have an impact on conversion. It's hard, and I'd never do it, actually say is, I think yellow buttons work better than blue. It depends on the brand. It depends on, you know, the relationship you have with your audience. But it is certainly true that there are certain brands, you know, who have tested out a different color to a button, and it has delivered a 20% increase in conversions overnight. And you've got to test those kind of things out. And as we'll touch on later in this deck, that kind of approach to experimentation and testing things out and analyzing the results is critical to becoming.
Yeah. And think about that big Google split test from years ago, Tim, where they spent millions of dollars on it. And it was all just about color variants, but they found that the color red actually was far more impactful because we associate the color red with being on alert. So they chose that color for notifications for a reason in your inbox. And again, one of my favorite things about the Piano platform and the technology we have is how you can split test very granular things like color schemes, like messaging copies. And in fact, the next slide, we're going to talk about how the Daily Maverick actually managed to split test on messaging copy and the intricacies of that. So what you're seeing on this slide here are 3 different use cases for a welcome message. So you could thank a reader for visiting a site. You could offer a personal thank you, a personal note from the editor-in-chief. Or you could promote a newsletter or a subscription straight away from the get-go. Working with the Daily Maverick, we generated 3 pieces of copy that played into each use case. It sounds simple so far. But what was interesting about their work was that they wanted to test cognitive biases. So many of you will have heard of cognitive biases as a phrase, and all of us are subject to them on a daily basis. So if you look at these examples of copy, if we wanted to thank somebody for visiting the site, we could highlight an experienced newsroom, plays into authority bias, need for information. We could thank them and say that they're part of a huge community of readers, plays into a bandwagon bias, the need for social proof before you undertake an action. Or you could simply thank them for being part of something, in this case, helping the publication to defend truth in an era of fake news. I call this the IKEA bias, because people value something a lot more if they have a say in building it. So think about all of the IKEA products that you've built in the last few years, and they might not be brilliant products, but your part in building them gives you a greater sense of attachment to them. And I think we can really replicate some of these biases in publishing, and that's exactly what the Daily Maverick did. And it's interesting that actually what they found by playing this out to their readers is that readers had a huge preference for a personal note from an editor-in-chief or a CEO of the company. They wanted to make that connection with their face. And then actually in terms of copy, across every single thing that they tested, IKEA bias came out on top. So their readers wanted agency. They wanted a sense of responsibility in building the Daily Maverick into what it can be tomorrow. So there's some cool lessons from that. And Tim, I'm sure you've got loads of examples of biases being brought into play across clients you work with as well. So it's a cool frontier. So we can skip to the next slide. Here are a few more examples from market now of messaging strategies that are not just reflecting best practice, but actually helping their brands to stand out. So if you take the example of The New Yorker, it's a fantastic cartoonist at The New Yorker. They used one of their own cartoons in their metered paywall notification. So when a reader came to the point in their journey where they'd maybe had 3 or 4 articles for free, they were hit with a metered wall. But the fact that they've added a bit of personality to this encourages that sense of communicating with a brand here. This is a relationship almost. If you look at the example in the middle, Actuality in Slovakia, they tested the wording of I want to support versus I want to donate. Now, I want to support is a bit of a lighter ask. It's a vaguer ask. More people were willing to select that option. And then if you look at the Telegraph, there's so many things to admire about this interaction in this customer journey stage. So look at how the color on register is subconsciously calling the reader to pre-select it. The wording, the messaging, we're glad you're enjoying the Telegraph. It's less aggressive. It's almost an apology for interrupting the reader as they engage with that content. Tim, I don't know if you want to speak to anything across these 3 examples.
Yeah, the Telegraph's a very important one, because the reason why they're confident, channeling that user towards register, is they have confidence in the follow-up messaging that will appear once they're registered, i.e. they've captured some details about them, then they can market to them. It is very hard to get someone to come cold to a site and convert immediately and start a trial. Some users might do it, but if you think back to that customer journey we outlined at the beginning, this is just a smart way of getting people to register. It's a softer ask. If you're presented with pay or register, 99% of people are going to register because they don't have to commit. But once they're registered, think through, okay, well, how am I going to message them over the course of my developing relationship with them to then convert them to become a paid subscriber? So certainly the Telegraph here is displaying quite a lot of confidence in its approach and taking that sort of longitudinal approach to the relationship with that potential user.
Absolutely. So hopefully, if thinking back to what you said at the very start of this webinar, Tim, the idea of like the right message, to the right people at the right time in the right place. Hopefully you can see across all of these different micro conversions in the customer journey, there's a lot of nuances to the strategies that are in play in market today, whether that's split testing on design, whether that's applying cognitive biases to messaging, or whether that's catering to reader needs in terms of when and how you show your template. So we can go to the next slide, I think. So this is one of the final stages in the customer journey, and this number to many people on the call, it might seem a bit low. It's important to note that in terms of piano benchmark for customer conversion, it varies massively. I've seen this be as high as 5 or 6, maybe even a bit higher in terms of percentage. It's kind of weighed down by a lot of the bigger clients in market that we work with, who for them to convert this percentage of their customers would be a very good result, I think. So again, Tim, feel free to jump in, but I think when we get to this point in the relationship with a segment of readers, we need to be really clear in terms of how we present that offer and how we then go on to keep the reader involved. Because this is a critical moment, right? We spent potentially months encouraging a reader segment to accelerate through that customer journey. And now we come to the crunch where we need to make that ask for payment. So definitely we can have a look in a moment at some examples from the market.
Yeah, I think the add here is, yes, the conversion rate looks relatively low, but I think it's also arguably quite realistic. If you think back to those stats at the beginning around the proportion of users to a website who are generally one-off visitors, you do get a sense of, well, on most websites, most users are not that loyal, don't have that much value. So all of this is about funneling that user through the funnel and getting to a point where they're going to convert. And naturally, it's going to get smaller as you go through. I think, as Matthew says, conversion rates vary dramatically. And there are so many reasons and so many sort of aspects that impact on the conversion rate. But as Matthew says, we actually have one client who converts at 19%. 0.18 here is the median.
Yeah, I think there's so many factors, as you say. If you look at geography being one of those key ones, so you have a lot of markets where paid media has been around for a long time. Think about the fact that the Wall Street Journal, for instance, they developed their paywall in 1997, which is crazy to me. Look at Norway, where I'm based here, where paid media is the norm. I'd imagine that customer conversion rates in Norway will be even higher than the 19% you just mentioned, Tim, be in the 30s or 40s, because publications have had a lot longer to convince their readers that journalism is worth paying for. We forget sometimes that actually, for a lot of publishers, this is a brave new frontier, and things don't happen overnight. It takes time for audience habits to develop. And as long as we're catering them to reader needs, then we're definitely moving in the right direction. Great. So here's an example of when you get it right, this is what it can look like. This slide is showing you Business Insider's revenue curve across a year working with piano. And so you can see that what's driving this revenue increase, all of the little changes that are being made, all of the different actions in terms of design updates, template changes, UX changes, messaging copy changes. And for every change that is made, you add more revenue because you're learning about your audience as you go through and you're applying those learnings into action.
Yeah, the way I sort of describe it is, no one can tell you how your audience are going to react. The only people who can are the audience themselves. So you need to continually ask questions of them to understand their reaction and then tailor your offers to that. So it's a constant conversation. And this slide is powerful. We can't show you the actual revenue numbers, but it's pretty significant. But it's really just showing that the more questions you ask, the more refinement and optimization you do of the messaging, of the design, of the language, it drives results.
Absolutely. Great. And perhaps just one of those optimizations that we could look at in a bit more detail here. So on the surface, this just looks like a paywall ask, looks like a template that maybe pops up as a modal. But when you actually look at it in detail, there's so much going on here in terms of messaging strategy. So let's just look at a few examples. So the idea of presenting that partnership with Digiday to add to the value proposition. Again, the color, pre-selecting the annual subscription package, which of course is more valuable. Presenting savings instead of costs, because again, denomination, cognitive bias dictates that people would rather gain, they'd rather not lose $5 than gain it, for instance. So again, that's powerful. So there's lots going on, and I just kind of wanted to flag one or two things on this template.
I think it's also important. They're very clear at just defining the overall value proposition, the benefits, and it's a very clean presentation. There's also something that we, as you sort of touched on, that decoy pricing is very important. There's a clear route down which the user is being channeled. Mm-hmm. Clearly, Business Insider here is trying to sell an annual subscription. Yeah. What we're really, I think as Piano, we'd encourage people, if they are going to get into this business, to sell annual subscriptions above monthly if you can. Mm-hmm. If you can, don't even offer monthly, because the simple reason, on a monthly basis, you've got more opportunity to see that user churn. An annual gives you a chance to get someone in, for them to build a relationship with you to further that relationship with them, and then hopefully retain them longer out. But
one thing as well, Tim, here that I just want to kind of comment on is the use of decoy pricing, which I think again plays back into that IKEA bias that we just talked about, right? Because readers are being given a choice, and they come to their own conclusion using their own agency that actually a certain package is best for them. So they almost have a stake in the package that they end up getting. So we find at Piano that using decoy pricing is far more effective than just presenting one or two prices, because it widens that reader choice.
Yeah, the cancel thing is very interesting as well, because for those of us who live in the UK, you may be familiar with certain newspaper brands who've made it very, very difficult to cancel a subscription. In fact, the only way you can do it is by calling up a line. You can't do it online. Our data actually shows that if you make it really easy for a user to cancel, they can cancel at any time. You can give them a refund of whatever's left. They are significantly more likely to come back and build a relationship with you in future. If you make that cancellation difficult, they'll never come back. So all these kind of things you've got to think through in terms of that long-term relationship with the user.
Great. If we go to the next slide. So there's the old adage, isn't there, if it can take months to gain a subscriber and seconds to lose them. So I think people often forget about this very important stage in the customer journey. And the further into this subscriptions world that we go, I'd imagine the more savvy publishers will become in terms of retention, because the bigger their audience they have that is signed up to a subscription package, the more they will have an interest in keeping it. So we find at Piano that typically 20% of readers cancel within the first month. And there can be a range of factors for that. Buyer's remorse is the big one. You sign up to Amazon Prime and then you wish, actually, I wish I'd spent that money on something else. I'm sure everyone on the call can think of a few examples where they've cancelled a subscription in the first month. So again, what are the messaging tactics that we can implement here to reduce churn? And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. I think it varies so much by brand. So again, I tried to flag 3 examples from the market of very different tactics that are being used here. So if we look at the one in the middle, the New York Times, so the idea of we're not stopping, neither should you, plays back into that IKEA bias. If we look at the Business Insider example, actually making that personal connection using the global editor-in-chief there to communicate with the person and try and find out a little bit more about why they've cancelled and bring back that sense of brand into play. Again, Tim, you'll have seen loads of these, and I think there's increasingly more nuances in the field of retention.
And I think what underpins successful ones is a degree of respect and a degree of confidence in the messaging. You're having a sort of adult relationship with them, and you're not making it difficult. You're trying to ask their opinion, and you're trying to build that relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And tailoring it back to your assumptions about different segments' needs, again, is important. So we can skip through to, I think it's our final slide, isn't it, Tim, for today?
Yeah. No, I think this is timed quite well. And, here, we'll obviously, the deck will be available to download in due course. You'll get a copy of it. These stats are based on our benchmark across the platform. They just help to give you an understanding of how you should be thinking about customer journey and about the messaging at each stage of this framework, and really to look at it in terms of, well, when a new user comes to your site, you're trying to drive them to become more active. Once they become active, you want to propose something to them that enables you to build that closer relationship with them. Once that engagement is there, you want to know them, you want them to register. And once they're registered, you want them to become a customer, and then you want them to remain loyal and become an advocate for your brand. And, that's a classic funnel. It's not always entirely linear, as I said at the beginning, but I think it's a useful framework to think about how important the messaging is at every stage. And, I think if we leave you with one message today, it's really, you've got to understand it's a set of micro conversions. And those little conversions are helping you build that deeper relationship with your potential subscriber.
Yeah, and I'd add to that, Tim, it's micro conversions across very different audience segments, right? So really playing this back into reader needs is so crucial to success. It's never been more crucial, I don't think. More and more people are looking to publications to deliver on their very changing needs, and I think, hopefully we've managed to present how some people in the market are doing that today.
Yeah. Great. Now, are there any questions? I can see a couple. There's one about Jazz. So I hand back to you. Are you on mute?
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting myself off mute, that typical VC moment there. Thank you guys, that was really thoroughly interesting. I really enjoyed the mix of theory and then actual kind of examples, and a variety of examples, because I know that will help our audiences who are in different sizes and types of businesses to translate this theory into practicality. One of the questions I'm just going to pick up on from the Q&A is, you talked about audience feedback and kind of involving them in the conversation to drive improvements. Amy asks, what methods are companies using to collect that feedback in a way that builds loyalty and engagement, rather than kind of being a push or something that detracts from your audience relationship? Do you have any hints and tips around how to collect that feedback as part of your journey?
That's a great question from Amy, so I can have a pass at it, Tim, and then just interrupt me again. But I see so many different tactics at the moment, and again, it depends on when you're seeking that feedback. Are you seeking it from a customer? Are you seeking it from a first-time reader? But some of the examples would include things like gamification. So how can you actually say to a reader, you're our perfect customer. We need more people like you. Can we, have some feedback from you? We'll reward you with X, Y, or Z if you do. Tim, any examples that you want to touch on?
Well, I think when I specifically refer to getting feedback, it's not so much surveys and asking them questions, the language I'm using around questions is present them with, present them with that invitation to sign up for a newsletter. Then you'll get data back that helps you understand how successful that is in comparison to another set of messaging. That's not to say that running surveys and understanding why people have cancelled or why they haven't isn't important, but I agree with you. Constantly asking those kind of qualitative questions would get quite irritating. But I think the point we're saying, this is all about data, and the more data you have on your audience, how they pay, the more successful you're going to be. And that's really what I mean by questions, asking questions of the audience.
Yeah, so it's good. There's two ways of seeing it. It's two sides of the same coin. Is you can split test via things like newsletter signups and see which one wins, or you can actually directly ask your audience at different stages when the timing is right, why you need their survey feedback.
Yeah, exactly.
Great, thank you very much. One question just from me, which I was really keen to ask, and I'm glad I get this opportunity. There was lots in there around kind of balancing the tailored messages consistently across the journey, A/B testing, tailored testing, whatever you want to call it. And I think for a lot of people on this call, of the attendees, kind of COVID is an accelerating environment in which they're getting more and more digital data and more opportunities to do these things, but equally it's limiting people's budgets. So I wondered if you had any hints and tips on kind of where to start with the testing or across the journey or segments or anything. So just some specific hints and tips of where to start.
Yeah, great question. For me, I kind of see publisher challenges being split into three different categories today. So you have the challenges of those who don't have a product in market. They maybe don't have as much audience data as they would like. Then you have those who perhaps have a product, maybe have it in their heads a bit, and they want to launch it. So how can they get started at an affordable price versus those who need help formulating that product? And then finally, you have those who have been in market for a long time and they just need help kind of optimizing what's new in the ever-changing world of subscriptions, and how can we leverage more tests to gain better results. And I think from a piano perspective, we have different offerings that suit like publishers at each stage in that journey. Definitely, I think it depends on the publisher and their needs as to how they should get started. But sometimes just asking for feedback, sometimes trying to pick out what are the core 5 value propositions of a product, or what are the 5 tests that we've seen others in the market running that we could run, and really starting simple and applying complexity over time. That would be my answer. I don't know about you, Tim.
Great, thank you very much. That's all the time we have today. Thank you so much again for the theory, the case studies, and getting into the questions. Just to finish up, we are of course still in our webinar series. The webinar next week is Back to Manifesto, and it's around shifting an organization into engagement thinking, if you want to sign up. In terms of what else you can do between now and next week, the video will go up on our website and you can get the slides and the video there. Also on the website, there is a Get in Touch tab. It's a contact form, but that contact form goes directly to Tim, Johnny, Sam, Kim, and myself, the kind of core of the collective, and we will pick up questions directly. So if you want to continue the conversation, you can do that there. We've also got our Twitter handle here, Building a Sub Business, and you can use our hashtag #subsbusiness to talk to us online as well. We would love to hear more from you before next week, and we'd love to see you again next week. Thanks for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.